There's a story unfolding in the Arizona desert that sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet it is real, and it exposes one of the most uncomfortable truths about water in the American West. In the remote basins of rural Arizona, on land far from the cities, foreign-owned agricultural operations, including farms tied to Saudi Arabia, have been pumping vast quantities of water out of the ground to grow hay, and much of that hay is shipped overseas to feed livestock in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the great cities of Arizona, Phoenix and Tucson and their sprawling suburbs, home to millions of people, face a future of tightening water restrictions and looming cuts as the Colorado River that sustains them shrinks. The paradox is stark and infuriating. Water is being pumped out of Arizona and effectively exported abroad while Arizonans are told to conserve. But beneath the outrage lies a colder, more revealing story, a story of law and geography, and a brutal arithmetic that explains why, in a very real sense, the Saudi-linked farms may be more secure in their water than the cities are. This is the math that almost no one explains, and once you understand it, you understand something fundamental and disturbing about the future of water in the West. The tale of two waters. To grasp the brutal math, you have to understand that not all water in Arizona is the same in the eyes of the law, and this distinction is the key to the entire paradox. Arizona draws its water from two fundamentally different sources, governed by two fundamentally different sets of rules, and the difference between them determines who is vulnerable and who is secure. The first source is surface water, above all the Colorado River, which is delivered to the cities and farms of central Arizona through a massive system of canals. The second source is groundwater, the water stored in aquifers deep beneath the desert, pumped up through wells. These two kinds of water could hardly be treated more differently, and that difference is the heart of the story. The Colorado River water that supplies Arizona's cities is intensely managed, measured, allocated, and, crucially, subject to cuts. It is governed by a complex web of interstate agreements and priority systems that determine exactly who gets how much, and when shortages strike, who loses water first. Arizona, because of the particular history of how it secured its share of the river, holds a relatively junior position in that priority system, meaning that when the Colorado River runs short and cuts are imposed, Arizona is among the first to feel them. The water that flows to the cities through the Great Central Canal is precisely the water most exposed to reduction as the river declines. Groundwater, by contrast, especially in the rural areas outside the state's regulated zones, operates under a far looser regime. In much of rural Arizona, there is little to no limit on how much groundwater a landowner can pump. If you own or lease the land and can drill a well, you can, in many of these areas, pump as much water as you want, with no meter, no cap, and no requirement to account for what you take. This is the fundamental asymmetry. The cities depend on a metered, allocated, cuttable supply, while the rural farms sit atop an essentially unregulated one. And that asymmetry is the engine of the brutal math. How the foreign farms fit into this legal landscape stepped foreign agricultural operations, and their strategy makes a cold kind of sense once you understand the rules. Companies from water-scarce nations, including those tied to Saudi Arabia, sought out places where they could grow water-intensive crops like alfalfa, a type of hay used to feed livestock such as dairy cattle. Alfalfa is notoriously thirsty, requiring enormous amounts of water to grow, and in many water-scarce countries it has become impractical or even prohibited to grow it domestically precisely because it consumes so much water. So these operations looked abroad for places where water was available and cheap, and they found exactly what they were looking for in the rural basins of Arizona. The appeal was simple, and from a business standpoint, entirely rational. In these rural Arizona basins, the groundwater was essentially free for the taking, no limit on pumping, no meter, and land that could be bought or leased at reasonable cost, sometimes on very favorable terms. A company could acquire the land, drill wells, pump as much of the underground water as it needed to grow vast fields of alfalfa, harvest the crop, and ship it across the ocean to feed livestock back home. In effect, the water of the Arizona desert, embedded in the hay, was being exported abroad. From the perspective of a water-scarce nation, this was a brilliant solution, rather than depleting their own precious water to grow feed. They could use someone else's water. in a place where the law placed almost no restriction on taking it. The hay itself is sometimes described as virtual water, the water it took to grow the crop, effectively shipped overseas in solid form. And because Arizona's rural groundwater was so lightly regulated, there was little standing in the way. The foreign farms were not doing anything secret or illegal. They were simply exploiting, with ruthless efficiency, a gap in the way Arizona governs its water. Why the cities are so exposed now, we arrive at the other side of the brutal equation, and it is here that the injustice becomes most visible. Arizona's cities, Phoenix, Tucson, and the vast metropolitan areas around them, home to the overwhelming majority of the state's population, depend heavily on the Colorado River, delivered through the enormous canal system that carries the river's water hundreds of miles across the desert to the urban centers. This is the water that lets millions of people live in one of the driest regions of the country. And it is precisely this water that is most threatened by the river's decline. The problem is twofold. First, the Colorado River is shrinking, gripped by a prolonged drought and a warming climate that have reduced its flow, while more water has been promised to users than the river actually carries. As the great reservoirs fall, cuts to deliveries become necessary, and those cuts fall according to the priority system. Second, and cruelly, Arizona's central canal water holds a junior priority in that system, a consequence of the political bargain the state struck decades ago to get the canal built in the first place. In exchange for federal approval and funding of the project, Arizona agreed that its canal water would take a subordinate position, to be cut before the water of others in times of shortage. That bargain, which seemed acceptable when the river was assumed to be abundant, has become a trap now that the river is running short. It means that when shortages are declared on the Colorado, the water delivered to central Arizona through that canal is among the very first to be reduced. So the cities sit on a supply that is both shrinking and legally first in line to be cut, exactly the opposite of the position occupied by the rural farms pumping unregulated groundwater. The urban millions, for all their economic and political weight, depend on the most vulnerable water in the state, while the foreign-linked farms depend on some of the most secure. The brutal math laid bare here, then, is the brutal math in its full and uncomfortable clarity. The water that the Saudi-linked farms rely upon, the unregulated groundwater of the rural basins, is, under current law, largely immune from the cuts and restrictions that govern surface water. There is no priority system reaching down into those aquifers to ration the pumping. No interstate compact dictating how much can be taken. No mechanism by which a shortage on the Colorado River translates into a reduction in what the farms can pump. As long as there is water in the ground and a well to reach it, the pumping can continue. The farms are, in the language of water, insulated from the crisis that is squeezing the cities. They will, in this narrow legal sense, survive, their access to water largely untouched by the forces bearing down on the rest of the state. The cities, by contrast, sit directly in the path of those forces. Their Colorado River water is shrinking, their priority is junior, and their cuts are already beginning and are projected to deepen. When the arithmetic is laid out plainly, the conclusion is jarring. A foreign company pumping groundwater to grow hay for export faces fewer legal constraints on its water than a major American city trying to supply drinking water to millions of its own residents. This is not because anyone designed it to be so out of malice. It is the accidental product of two separate legal systems. One for surface water, tightly controlled, and one for rural groundwater, barely controlled at all, colliding with a drought that exposes the gap between them. The math does not care about fairness. It simply follows the rules as they are written, and as they are written, the unregulated aquifer is safer than the metered canal. That is why, in the provocative but accurate framing, the Saudi farms will survive while the cities face a reckoning. The groundwater loophole, the deeper root of all this, lies in a specific and consequential feature of Arizona water law, one that dates back decades and that has left a large portion of the state's groundwater essentially unmanaged. In the late 20th century, Arizona passed a landmark groundwater law designed to bring order to the pumping of underground water, a genuinely forward-thinking measure for its time. But that law focused its strongest protections and regulations on certain designated areas, primarily the urban and agricultural zones where most of the population and economic activity were concentrated. The areas around the major cities. Within those managed zones, groundwater pumping is regulated, monitored, and subject to rules designed to prevent the aquifers from being drained. But outside those designated zones, across vast stretches of rural Arizona, the law left groundwater largely unregulated. In these rural areas, there remained little limit on how much water a landowner could pump. No requirement to measure it, and no mechanism to prevent a single large operation from drawing down an entire aquifer. This is the loophole, the gap in the fence, and it is precisely into this gap that the foreign agricultural operations moved. They located their farms in exactly these unregulated rural basins, where they could pump without limit and without oversight. The law that so carefully governed water in the cities simply did not reach the remote basins where the alfalfa farms took root. This mismatch, rigorous control in the urban zones, near total freedom in the rural ones, is the legal foundation of the entire paradox. It means that the state has the tools to manage water where its people live, but has left large areas of its groundwater open to unlimited extraction, including by those who would pump it to grow crops for export. And as the aquifers in those rural areas are drawn down, the consequences fall on the rural communities and neighbors whose own wells can run dry as the water table drops. A quiet crisis unfolding far from the cities, but no less real. The human cost in the countryside, while the framing pits Saudi farms against Arizona cities, there is a third party in this story whose suffering is often overlooked: the rural residents and small communities who live near the large pumping operations. In the unregulated basins, when a massive agricultural operation drills deep, high-capacity wells and pumps enormous volumes of water, the water table can drop, and when it drops, the shallower wells that ordinary rural households and smaller farms depend on can go dry. These are people who have lived on the land for generations, who suddenly find that their wells no longer reach water, that they must drill deeper at great expense or haul water in, all because the aquifer beneath them is being drawn down faster than it can recharge. This is the hidden human cost of the groundwater loophole, and it adds a bitter dimension to the brutal math. The rural communities have neither the secure position of the foreign farms, which own or lease the land and command the resources to drill the deepest wells, nor the political weight and infrastructure of the great cities. They sit in the middle, vulnerable to the pumping happening around them, watching the water that their lives depend on being drawn down and shipped away, with little legal recourse in areas where the pumping is not regulated. Their plight is a reminder that the crisis is not simply a contest between foreign agribusiness and urban America, but a complex collision that catches ordinary people in its gears, people whose water security is being sacrificed to a legal gap that was never closed. The depletion of these aquifers is also, in many cases, effectively permanent on any human timescale, because the water in them accumulated over thousands of years and recharges extraordinarily slowly, so what is pumped out today may not be replaced for millennia. The countryside is being quietly emptied of its ancient water, and the people who live there are paying the price. Why this sparked outrage and changed the story of the foreign farms pumping Arizona's water eventually became a public scandal, and understanding why illuminates both the power of the paradox and the difficulty of resolving it. When Arizonans learned that foreign-owned operations were pumping vast quantities of the state's groundwater, largely unregulated and at little cost, to grow hay that was then shipped overseas, all while the state's residents were being asked to conserve and while the cities faced cuts to their Colorado River supply, the reaction was one of understandable anger. The image was simply too stark: the state's precious water, in a time of drought, being effectively exported abroad to benefit a foreign nation, while Arizonans tightened their belts. It felt like a betrayal, an absurd inversion of priorities, and it became a rallying point for those demanding reform of the state's water laws. In response, there have been moves to address the most egregious aspects of the situation, including efforts to end favorable land leases that had allowed some of these operations to access water on state land at low cost, and a broader push to finally regulate groundwater in the rural areas that the original law left uncovered. These efforts reflect a growing recognition that the groundwater loophole is untenable in an era of deepening water scarcity, that a state cannot secure its future while leaving vast portions of its water open to unlimited extraction. But closing the loophole is politically and practically difficult, entangled in questions of property rights, rural interests, agricultural economics, and the deep-seated resistance to new regulation that characterizes water politics across the West. Change has been slow and contentious, and much of the rural groundwater remains, as of now, lightly governed. The outrage has been real and has driven some reform, but the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of the brutal math, regulated surface water for the cities, largely unregulated groundwater for the rural farms, has not been fully resolved, and until it is, the paradox endures. Why alfalfa is at the center of it all, it is worth pausing on the crop itself. Because the choice of alfalfa is not incidental to this story, but central to it, and understanding why illuminates the whole strange economy of exported water. Alfalfa is a perennial hay, a green leafy forage that is among the most nutritious feeds available for livestock, especially dairy cattle, which is why it is so prized by the dairy industries of the world. But alfalfa has a defining characteristic that shapes everything. It is extraordinarily thirsty. Growing it requires enormous quantities of water, more than most other common crops, and in a hot desert climate like Arizona's, where the sun bakes the fields and evaporation is relentless, the water demand climbs higher still. To grow alfalfa in the desert is in effect to pour vast amounts of water onto the land, water that largely comes from the aquifer below. This is precisely why water-scarce nations turn to Arizona to grow it. In countries where water is desperately short, dedicating scarce domestic water to a crop as thirsty as alfalfa makes little sense, and some have curtailed or effectively ended its cultivation at home to conserve their own water. But their livestock, especially their dairy herds, still need to be fed. And so the solution was to grow the thirsty crop somewhere else, somewhere the water was cheap and unregulated, and ship the harvested hay home. Arizona, with its unregulated rural groundwater and its sunny climate ideal for growing hay, became one of those somewhere elses. In this way, the alfalfa functions as a vessel, a container for water, carrying the desert's ancient groundwater across the ocean in the form of dried green bales. Every ton of hay shipped out represents a large quantity of Arizona water that will never return, embedded invisibly in the crop and consumed on the other side of the world. The crop is the mechanism by which the water is exported, and its extraordinary thirst is what makes the whole arrangement so consequential for a state already running short. The deeper lesson of the brutal math stepped back from the specific scandal of the Saudi-linked farms, and the story reveals a profound and unsettling lesson about water, law, and the future of the American West. The paradox is not really about foreign villains or a single loophole. It is about the fundamental mismatch between the way we govern water and the reality of scarcity, and about how legal structures written in one era can produce perverse and dangerous outcomes in another. The rules that make the farms more secure than the cities were not designed to produce that result. They emerged piecemeal, over decades, from separate histories and separate assumptions, and only when drought pressed down on the whole system did their combined effect become clear. The brutal math is the product of a legal patchwork colliding with a physical crisis. The deeper lesson is that in an age of growing water scarcity, the security of any water supply depends not only on the physical availability of the water, but on the legal and political structures that govern access to it. The cities of Arizona are vulnerable not because there is no water, but because the water they depend on is the water most exposed to cuts under the rules as they exist. The farms are secure not because their water is more plentiful, but because the rules governing it are so much looser. This means that the future of water in the West will be determined as much by law and policy as by rain and snow, that the choices made about how to regulate groundwater, how to allocate surface water, and how to balance competing demands will decide who survives the coming scarcity and who does not. The brutal math is not fixed. It is a product of choices, and it can be changed by different choices. Whether Arizona and the broader West will make those choices, closing the loopholes, aligning the rules with the reality of scarcity, ensuring that the water beneath the ground is governed as carefully as the water in the canals, remains one of the great open questions of the region's future. For now, the paradox stands as a stark illustration of how strange and how unjust the arithmetic of water can be. In the Arizona desert, foreign-linked farms pump ancient groundwater to grow hay for export, their access largely untouched by the crisis around them, while the cities that house millions of Americans face a tightening future of cuts and restrictions on their shrinking share of the Colorado River. The math is brutal precisely because it is indifferent to what seems fair, following instead the cold logic of the rules as they are written. Saudi farms will survive, in that narrow legal sense, and Arizona's cities face a reckoning, not because of any grand conspiracy, but because of the accumulated weight of decisions made long ago, now exposed by a drought that spares no one from its consequences except, for the moment, those who happen to sit atop the water that the law forgot to protect. That is the brutal math, and it is a warning about